After what seemed like an eternity, I've finally come to realize that what I encountered almost 10 years ago was what you cryptozoologist types refer to as a dogman. For years, I thought that thing that I saw was a werewolf, but I guess I was wrong, because apparently, these two creatures are totally different from one another. Hopefully, both of these things don't really exist. I know the dogman does, but thinking that there's other things out there that could be preying on innocent people is almost too much for me to handle. I fear what else is out there now, and you'll rarely catch me somewhere that I'm unfamiliar with. So now that I have your attention, let me set the scene for you as I try to explain the weirdest and scariest thing I have ever seen in my entire life. A side note to anyone listening to this, just sitting down and typing this up is really freaking me out. It's only 8:43 in the morning, the sun is out. I live in New York City, clearly not a place Dogman would take a stroll, or at least I hope so. Still though, I have goosebumps and butterflies in my stomach just thinking about that night. This was something that has hung for me for a long time. It was November of 2012, and I was driving with my sister to visit our grandparents in Vermont. We lived in upstate New York at the time, and thought a road trip would be fun. Famous last words, right? From what I remember about our trip, we were just chatting. I don't remember about what, but I do remember it was snowing. Not too bad, just a little bit of snow. It'd been snowing for a few days though, and the sides of the interstate were starting to build up. That's when I saw what I at first thought was a large black rock, or log, that was sticking out of the snow. As we neared it though, I started seeing that it was moving, and thought to myself, what the hell is that? I thought maybe it was a bear, or something like that, but it'd be weird this late in the year, wouldn't it? I'm not a bear expert, so I pointed it out to my sister and she shrugged, not even really caring much, just getting too involved in our conversation. It wasn't too long after that, though, that it seemed all hell broke loose, and I thought we might actually die. 'Cause that bear turned out to not be a bear. Definitely not a bear. A bear wouldn't give me nightmares for the next decade. In fact, it turned out to be the scariest fudging thing I have ever seen. This part, I remember clearly, even though my sister has a hard time recalling most of the details. Honestly, I think she tries to block it out because it was so damn scary. The dogman looked like it was lying down in the snow, and then all of a sudden popped up in a squat position, like someone ready to run a race or something. Even on all fours, this thing was already huge, and I knew that whatever it was bad news. I got this sinking feeling in my stomach, like warning bells trying to warn of some extreme danger. I actually could have thrown up at that point, the way my body reacted to it. It looked in our direction, and it snapped its head towards us. And even though we weren't extremely close to this thing at the time, I could tell that it was baring its teeth. I sped up, wanting to get the hell away from there, which, retrospect, bad idea. I think it felt challenged when I did this. I think it has a level of intelligence that other animals don't. I think it knew what a car was and that there were people inside of it. I swear to you, when I sped up, this thing stood up on two legs and faced off with us. My sister was screaming about it. I was yelling too. It was not a fun time. On two legs, it had to pass the 8-foot mark. Everything about its proportions was just incredibly big. Imagine taking a Bigfoot and then making him a werewolf, because that's what this shitting thing looked like. Like a big ass werewolf. It was black but had snow all over it. The fur was shaggy, the torso was elongated and muscular. The arms looked longer than they should be. I think they could have gone past the knees. The head was large and canine with a long muzzle. I'm not sure if I remember the ears correctly, but I think they were wolf-like too, in the sense that they stood up and didn't droop. As we were screaming and carrying on, trying to speed up and pass this thing, it started running at us. It was at this angle, but definitely towards us. It went onto the interstate, and it was aiming for the other side of the road, but it ran right in front of us at this angle where I think it was trying to intimidate us to get us to swerve the car off the road or something. I did swerve to avoid hitting it. The last thing I wanted to do was be stuck out there with a monster in a wrecked car. I swerved too much, and my car started to spin. I couldn't regain control, and we spun around in a 180-degree turn. I know we were now facing that thing again, and I really thought at this moment that it was going to attack us and we were going to die. It was back on all fours and just casually walking towards us. I was hyperventilating and on the verge of melting down completely. My sister couldn't stop screaming. Her words at this point, I couldn't even understand. It was like this thing knew how to get a car to stop or something, or knew how to make it crash. I felt baited. I felt like we fell into its trap. Whether it tries to crash cars as a hunting tactic or as an act of aggression, I don't know. I know we survived though, and that thing didn't attack our car. I know that in the 20 to 30 seconds it took me to get the car turned around, I saw something that made me feel as defenseless as humanly possible. I was looking at something I couldn't even fathom. Something that took the laws of man and threw them out the window completely. I know that we were so close, I could see how much it dwarfed us. We could see the steam coming out of its mouth as it panted. It looked like it was sheer muscle. A perfect killing machine. I saw claws on paws that looked more like hands. It was horrific. I could feel the anger coming from this thing. Maybe it was bloodlust. I don't know. It could have just been me freaking out, but this thing seemed completely evil. I know there's a lot of people out there that say it's just an animal, but I don't agree. I was able to turn the car back around as my sister continued to be in hysterics, and we sped off. It didn't follow us. We drove, both of us in tears, both of us still hyperventilating, until I needed to get gas. We pulled over, and my sister cried for a good 10 minutes. What had we just seen? We continued to drive to my grandma's, not stopping to see any of the things that we planned to. My sister had planned on driving half of the trip, but she was not in any condition to drive, so I just drove the whole time, most of which was in silence. We got there. Neither of us slept. We stayed up all night, lights on in the living room, finally talking about what it was that we saw. We told our families. They weren't sure what to think, but never said we were lying. I really think part of them believed us, but were too unnerved to talk about it themselves, and didn't want to actually admit that they thought that these things were real too. For years, I could have testified in court, stack of Bibles and all, that it was a werewolf. I know better now. I firmly believe we saw a dogman that night. What I don't know is where it came from, or why they're so hard to find. I've read a lot of theories out there, and I think the best one is that these things have some kind of power to walk between worlds. I don't know if they're from here, if you catch my drift. I'm not talking about a native species, I'm talking about something that is on this earth. I don't think that's where they come from. I'm not saying they're aliens, I just think they're from somewhere else. But anyway, we took a different way back home. I've never been on that stretch of road since, and I never plan on going down that stretch of road again as long as I live. I really hope that this story can encourage other people to share their stories of these things, because I know there's more people out there that are just too scared to talk about it. Hell, it took me a decade to finally get the courage to talk about this thing with people other than close friends and family. I want to thank you for sharing this story, and thank you for letting me understand that it's okay to send this to other channels as well. I think the more people that hear this story, and the more people that share this story, will help other people come out, and maybe, one day, we can get to the bottom of what these creatures really are. Thank you. Anonymous. My great-grandmother owned 28 acres in rural Kentucky. She left 14 of those acres to my Aunt Renee and 14 acres to my Gram. My Gram left her land and her house to my husband and I. But my experience actually happened before my husband and I ever met. About 8 years ago, I was out in the woods behind our house with an ex-boyfriend and my friend. We were exploring, and really just hanging out. Sometime during our escapade, I split from them and went off on my own. I know my land pretty well, as I grew up here, so I headed for a clearing I thought would be kind of nice to relax in. The clearing in question is pretty close to the edge of the woods, and you can even make out the back of my barn if you look hard enough. When I cleared the trees, I immediately felt like I was being watched, and it was so sudden and so intense I actually stopped in my tracks. Some part of my mind was in control, but it didn't feel like it was me, if that makes any sense at all. The part that was in control told me to turn around, so I'd face the way that I'd just come, but I should do it slowly and not make a sound. When I did turn, I didn't see anything right away, just the forest that I came out of, and what looked like a downed tree off to the left. But my head told me to move slowly out of the woods. In order to do that, I'd have to pass the downed tree, as the path to the woods runs out that way. For some reason, I really didn't want to do this. My body started moving for me though, and I made my way down the path towards the tree, keeping my eye on it. But the closer I got to it, the less tree-like it looked. Finally, I was in front of it, about 10 feet away, and it wasn't a tree. It was an impossibly large wolf-like creature, and it was staring right at me. It was lying down, with its head on its paws, and it was really just massive. If I only picked one word to describe how big this thing was, massive would be the word that I chose. I wanted to scream and run, but my mind wouldn't let me. It told me to be as quiet and slow as I could. I started to walk away from that thing, but we had a staring contest that felt like 30 minutes. In reality, it was more like 30 seconds. Even still, I got a great look at it. It was dark brown, as big as a black bear, and really still. Its eyes followed me as I moved, but that was all that moved. It was impossibly still. I know it wasn't a bear, because I know the difference between a bear and a canine, or whatever monstrous thing this thing actually turned out to be. I cleared the woods and immediately ran for my house, screaming for my ex and my friend. Weirdly enough, I didn't tell them what I saw, and didn't even want to. Not because it sounds crazy, but because I just didn't think I should. 5 years later, I was hanging out with my cousin, and I had the sudden urge to tell her what happened. She grew up around those woods too. She knows where that clearing is. I thought she wouldn't believe me, but the hairs on the back of her neck stood straight up while I was explaining that thing, and I knew at that point she'd seen it too. She told me when she was young, she was playing down by the barn with her siblings, which were my other cousins, and my Aunt Renee called them for dinner. My cousins went up to my aunt's house, but this cousin stayed to play. She was throwing rocks at a tree when she saw that same wolf creature come running out of the woods at her. She said it was fast enough to get from the wood line to the barn, about 200 feet, by the time she got to the orchard, which was only about 20 feet from the barn. She ran to Aunt Renee's house and never breathed a word of it about what she saw. The older she got, the more convinced she became that it had been a dream. I haven't been back to the clearing since that day, and my cousin's story explains why I never saw her go into the woods when I was young either. My sister hates it here, because she claims she feels watched. Everyone but me thinks she's ridiculous. My cousin theorized that it's a type of guardian spirit. It was angry with her for throwing rocks at the trees, and that's why it was aggressive with her. It didn't attack or chase me because I wasn't harming anything. But I'm not sure. It's only the best explanation we have, as no one knows about it but us. I'm telling my story for the first time to you guys, honestly, just so maybe someone could explain it for me. The weirdest thing about all of it was my cousin swears she remembers it having large purple-colored eyes that burned into her. But I don't remember what its eyes looked like. I stared into those eyes for 30 whole seconds, and to this day, I can't remember what they looked like. Only that they followed my movement. I apologize if this is sort of scattered or in the wrong format. I'm really tired. I just wanted to share my experience, and hopefully gain some insight if anyone has any information. For the record, I was 100% sober that day, and I do not have a history of hallucinations or delusions. In fact, I rated high for logical thinking and rational thought when I was evaluated. I know I'm not crazy, so what in the hell is it that I saw? My name is Sharon Russell. I've been an established medium and remote viewer all my life. I have a Dogman encounter that I want to share with you. It happened in 1975, and I was only 14 years old. My encounter happened in the Memorial Park in Wickford, Essex in the UK. This thing came from the River Crouch, which runs under the bridge where I encountered it. This river runs through miles and miles of wild country. To get to the gates, you have to walk through an open field that's about 200 to 300 yards from the roadside to the gate. At this point, I thought I had seen my friend Elizabeth at the gates, but she disappeared quickly from view. I hurried as fast as I could while carrying 2 heavy overnight bags. When I got there, I didn't see Elizabeth, so I stopped to look around and call out her name. I told her I knew she was there, so she should come out. I wasn't afraid. If she was trying to scare me, it wasn't going to happen. I heard some rustling sounds off by the left side of the thicket, which you would have to go through to get down to the riverbank. I heard some splashing in the river to the left side and called out to Elizabeth again, but she still didn't answer. When I heard splashing to the right side, I didn't even think that she could be over in the river at this time. I just giggled nervously and looked around, still calling out for her. Then the atmosphere grew stronger. Because of hearing more than one rustle on either side of the bridge, it was all getting stranger and stranger. On top of that, it was starting to get misty. Plus, hearing odd sounds in 2 different areas, I figured she brought our friend Linda with her. But they still didn't come out, so at this point, I started to get annoyed. I called out that I was going on, that they weren't scaring me, and that this was now boring me, so I headed for the bridge. I was still getting creeped out though, and was constantly trying to shrug those feelings off. I was still hearing the rustling in the bushes as I continued to the bridge, now louder, but behind me. It was near dark, but the lighting of the bridge still allowed me to see just fine. That's when I heard someone walking up behind me. At first, I didn't turn around. I figured Elizabeth would try to scare me, but then I heard the heavy footing and the slapping noise, and I knew it couldn't be her. I was too afraid to turn around. I knew it wasn't her or Linda behind me. The footsteps were just too heavy. My brain was going into overdrive. I was trying to analyze the situation. Then this horrific growl came from behind me. It was so loud, it rumbled my chest, my heart, and it felt like it took my soul out of my body. I just froze. It had come up from behind me, and going by the growl, it was taller than Elizabeth. I knew it had stopped right behind me, because the footsteps stopped, and I could feel the warm heat on the back of my neck. That's when I had to force myself to turn around. I turned around only halfway, and there it was, right in front of me, only about 4 or 5 inches away from me. A werewolf. It let out another low, bellowing growl in my face. I froze and actually wet myself right there on the spot. It had a dog face. It snarled and showed its teeth to me, and I was hit by its stinking breath. As I went into shock, my brain started to process a million details all at once. I thought to myself then that I was going to die, that it was going to kill me, and it was going to eat me. It looked like a wolf, but not a cute little wolf. This thing looked like a werewolf. I don't even like to say that word now because it causes me so much fright, but this thing that was standing so close in front of me looked just like a werewolf. It had huge teeth and fangs. I noticed flesh hanging off of its gums. Its hair was brown, with little bits of black mixed in. The hair was like a wolf or a bear. It had deep orange-red eyes, and they were full of the most intense rage imaginable. It continued to growl at me. The fear I felt was like nothing I've ever experienced. What I noticed was how its brow was creased while it snarled. and its movements with its expression. The eyelids themselves were almost bald, but the hair around it was darker. The brow hung over quite a bit. The nose looked almost bald and looked shiny, like it was wet. The ears were pointed, not as big as you hear. They were kind of small, pointed with hair on the ends, and the skin looked leathery. The neck, though, was thick, and the head was extremely huge, 3 or 4 times larger than a German Shepherd dog. The shoulders were protruding, just like huge muscles, like the Hulk. It had a hump on its back, and it made its neck look even more muscular. The arms were thick with hair, and it had hands, not paws. It had really long fingers. The claws looked half human, like they were stained and full of mud. They were probably 3/4 of an inch to an inch long. His face was so close to mine that I had to turn my head and just move my eyes around to see him. I needed to know what I was looking at. It was in a bent position, coming down to my level, sniffing me. My brain wasn't convinced that this thing was real still, yet the evidence told me that it was. Its chest was exposed, and quite bald, but it was rippling, absolutely rippling, with muscles. I couldn't see past the waist at this point. The weirdest part of this thing, though, was it had a ripped, shredded, dirty checkered shirt on. It was a sleeveless checkered shirt. It had ripped, dirty tan pair of trousers, but the clothes looked ancient. They were torn, bloodied, and filthy. Plus, did not fit them. The clothes were so shredded, they were hanging off of this thing. I looked down at the legs, and they looked exactly like a dog's legs, except for the huge feet. They looked partly human with large nails. It only had partial hair on the top of the feet. The legs were just like a dog's legs. They were bent back at the hock, but extremely muscular. I estimate that this thing was about 6.5 feet tall, maybe 6'8". I could not see if there was a tail. But it absolutely stank. It smelled like blood and dead animals. It was so smelly that it actually took my breath away. The scariest part for me at that moment was the aura that this thing gave off. It was like it was sucking my soul from the fear that it gave me. That's when my brain kicked in and I decided I needed to run for my life, because this thing was going to rip me to pieces. I knew I was dead. I knew this thing was going to kill me, but I had to push that fear from myself because I was absolutely frozen in it. I had tried to pry my hands open so I could release those heavy bags that I was carrying. Then, maybe I'd have more of a chance to run faster. I forced my frozen body to prepare for the run. I had to get away from it, and still at this point, it continued growling at me, all the while drips of drool dropped on my neck with its hot, stinking breath. All of this happened in seconds, but I was processing it all so extremely fast. And then, I dropped all my bags, which made it move just enough for me to escape, and I ran for my life across that bridge. But I knew that I was still going to die, for it gave chase to me, keeping up and close to my back. I ran up the embankment, across the field towards an alley, screaming the whole time, hoping my friend would be on her way and that she would see me and save my life. I honestly don't think I took one breath the whole time I was running and shouting and screaming for help. All I remember is my own voice and my screams the entire time, plus the sound of thumping feet and growls behind me all the way. That dogman gave chase, and it stayed on my heels the whole time. I knew any minute it was going to grab me, pull me down, and end my life. But, for some reason, it didn't. I knew I couldn't outrun it. There was absolutely no way. It could have easily taken me down whenever it wanted, but it let me go at the point of the alley, and a bright light appeared. I ran to my friend's house, and I almost tried crashing through the door. I banged on it until they let me in, and I fell to the floor, screaming and crying in hysterics. I started to yell at them that a werewolf was chasing me, and they needed to shut the door. As they talked to me, I could register that I was being talked to, but I couldn't register what they were saying to me. All I could hear was the growl in my ear. It was stuck with me or something. I couldn't hear anything else. Of course, they wanted to go investigate and get my bags, but I begged them to stay inside. I didn't want them to get killed by that thing. But Elizabeth's dad insisted going, even though I was hysterically begging him not to, and he wasn't gone that long. He came back with my bags and said they were right where I had dropped them on that bridge. He made a comment about him shivering down there by the bridge, and that he couldn't get back quick enough. It was like something there creeped him out too. The doctor was then called, and I was sedated to calm me down. After that, it didn't get much better though. I had terrible nightmares for years and years. I tried hypnotherapy, among other things, but that didn't work either. I still cannot really talk about it too much without getting frightened. I'm stronger now, although still afraid of the darkness, but I'm finally starting to talk about it all these years later. I did an interview with Daniel Stedman once. 11 days after that, I finally started talking about it to more people. But the nightmares have come back. Just not as bad as before. I could easily face any demonic horrors in my life, except for this thing. It leaves you with absolute terror, and it's a terror that you will not ever forget. I have a hard time dealing with the fact that it let me go. I know I should be grateful, but all I have to ask was, why didn't it kill me? Why did it chase me if it was just going to let me go? Why did it make itself known to me in the first place if it wasn't hunting me? Is it not finished with me yet? I actually think I interrupted a feeding or something, and that's why it had flesh on its teeth. I believe there's more intelligence to this creature than a dog, or wolf, or maybe even a human being. It's absolutely a unique creature. When I looked into its eyes, I felt like it knew me, like a human, even though this was some sort of beast. These things are real. I saw every part of this thing move. It growled, it drooled. The drool hit my face. The breath was hot and the growls were deafening. It definitely wasn't somebody dressed up in some Halloween costume. Hearing that other people have had encounters that are frightening as mine still scares the hell out of me. I fear for them, and I cry for some too. Thank you for telling this story on your new channel. And I give you this. Please don't look for these creatures. They are highly dangerous. Just because I survived doesn't mean you will. They choose their victims. Sharon. This happened to my uncle when I was about 7 years old. He's no longer with us, but I wanted to share this story for him. Growing up, I lived in northern Michigan on 5,000 acres of farm and ranch land that backed up into state land. We're talking nothing but miles of forest and pastures could be seen. Needless to say, it made us pretty tough, and it took a lot to spook us. We were all avid hunters, fishermen, outdoorsmen. Being the only girl, I was raised as a tomboy, and I was just the same as everybody else. My uncle went off to join the military, becoming a senior NCO in a prominent Special Forces division of the U.S. Navy. He was 6'4", built like a wrestler, obviously skilled in survival tactics, and nothing rattled him. He was home on leave and went out hunting as it was deer season. I remember him coming into the house, shaking and crying, saying he saw something in the woods. My uncle never cried. He was tough as nails, and would tear someone to shreds before he let them make him cry. My grandmother tried to get him to make sense, but all he kept saying was he saw something like Bigfoot mixed with a wolf. My granny immediately got my grandfather and rounded up the rest of the guys so they could go hunting. My dad, a few male cousins, my uncle, who was still terrified but went because he didn't want to be labeled a chicken. They all got their shotguns and ammunition and saddled the horses to go to the clear in the woods. Apparently, they were aware of the Dogman, but I was blissfully young and ignorant. They told me to stay inside, and for no reason was I to step outside of our house until they returned. I'd never heard my dad or grandfather so serious, so I hid in my room. Sunset comes, and they still aren't back. I'm really worried at this point because they never stayed in the woods after dark. Shortly, I heard the sounds of the horses running to the barns and their voices. I was so relieved to have them back. They looked troubled though when they came into the house, but didn't say anything, probably not to spook me. At dinner, my dad laid down the law that I was no longer allowed to play outside or go to the barns alone. I had to have my grandfather with me at all times. Of course, I was upset by this and felt my independence was being taken away, but I obeyed, because what else could I do? The next morning, my dad and grandfather taught me how to shoot. I knew that this situation was serious, and I decided then and there that I wouldn't argue about staying inside anymore. I overheard the adults talking the next night. Apparently, there were tracks where my uncle had his sighting, bigger than any wolf could make, but they were definitely canine tracks. As I said before, we're avid outdoorsmen and hunters. We can identify tracks easily, but these things couldn't be identified. About 8 feet up in a tree, they also found claw marks. They had no idea what could have made those marks. No bear could have done those. We also found claw marks about the same height on multiple trees throughout our property. We had cattle mutilated, and not in a coyote or a bear way. And that lasted the entire winter. We lost 30 to 40 cattle that winter, all of them mutilated, all by some unseen carnivore attacking and eating them. All with the same wolf or dog tracks in the snow. I really feel this experience changed my uncle. He did multiple tours in the Middle East for Desert Storm and Operation Iraqi Freedom before he committed suicide. After that experience, though, he was just never the same. He went from not ever drinking to never seeing him without a bottle of Jack, and his eyes always had this haunted look in them. I know he saw a lot of stuff in the Middle East, but I really feel like this Dogman encounter was what changed him for the worst. He changed his personality. He never went into the woods again. He quit hunting, and he eventually just quit coming over to visit on leave. He didn't even come home for my dad's funeral 2 years later. It's like he wanted nothing to do with that property or the monster that was in the woods. It was just heartbreaking to see him deteriorate the way that he did. I truly believe he saw something out there, and that's what eventually killed him. Dear Supernaturalist, I would like to begin by requesting that any details I give about my identity or the location of this encounter be kept private. Just thinking about writing this down is scaring me, and I'm typing now against my better judgment. But a very close friend of mine is urging me to share this horror story in hopes it might be some sort of cathartic experience. Along with my ever-present fear of what happened to me, I am also a high-ranking member of my profession, and do not wish for my colleagues to hear about this and call my sanity into question. I will not share my name, nor will I share the exact location this happened to me, or what my previously mentioned profession is. I will share that I am a female. This happened to me in the early fall of 2002, September 26th to be precise, in Wisconsin. A friend of mine and I had planned on taking a long weekend and retreating out into the woods for a 5-day camping trip. The day before we were set to depart, my friend informed me that she was unable to make the first half of our trip due to a work conflict, though she would be joining me that Friday. Being the adventurous type and having already taken the time off, I thought it would be a fun excursion and a peaceful couple of days if I ventured out into the forest all by myself. Now, in case you're thinking that this is not quite a sensible idea, I have spent many a night in the forest from the time I was a young girl up until this last camping trip, which was about a month prior to these events. The anniversary of the darkest night is just around the corner, and I have yet to venture back into the woods. And that was 20 years ago. The morning of my camping trip, I awoke early, eager to get on the road. I had a 3-hour drive ahead of me. I loaded up my camping gear into my car and was on the road by 7:30 a.m. Around 11 o'clock, I finally made it through the twisting roads, parked, and hiked my way into the woods to get a good spot. To make things easier for my friend to find our spot, I tied blue ribbons to trees along the way. A cute idea, I thought, as our mutual favorite color was blue. About 20 minutes and 2 other potential spots later, I decided against those and found what I thought to be the perfect spot. I set up camp, made myself lunch, and enjoyed a hike, followed by a relaxing afternoon and a peaceful night in front of my campfire. That night, I retired to my tent earlier than I normally would have, but the drive and multiple hikes had worn me out. About 10 o'clock or so, I extinguished my campfire and crawled into my tent. Sometime that night, I awoke to what appeared to be a large something or other traipsing about my campsite. I'm embarrassed to have no way of knowing what time it was or how long that something or other was out there, since I refused to illuminate my Indiglo watch. It seemed like a long time that animal, or whatever it was snooping around outside, but admittedly, it could have been only mere minutes. Once the sounds faded into the distance, I listened for another several minutes, and finally sighed in relief that, whatever it was, had went back to where it had come from. And I fell asleep again. The next morning, I awoke, feeling foolish that I let my fear get the best of me, and I exited my tent to look for tracks. Unfortunately, I believe that the ground was just too hard to produce any type of viable tracks. I again enjoyed the peaceful serenity of the forest after that. The entire day was filled with doing whatever I wanted, and I found myself imagining what it would be like to just live out here. Little did I know that my perfect image of the forest and all that it would offer would soon be shattered. Forever. Without any hope of ever gaining it back. A few hours after sundown, I sat by my fire, enjoying a few chapters of City of Bones by Michael Conley. The first thing that struck me as odd was how quiet the forest was. The previous night, it was abuzz with many different animals and insects, but this night, it seemed the whole forest had been vacated. Only mere minutes before that, I could hear all sorts of things talking into the night. But like I said, now you could hear a pin drop. A rustling sound behind me alerted me to the presence of something close, and I spun around, peering into the dark forest, but saw nothing. That's when the most pungent smell I've ever had the misfortune of introducing my nostrils to wafted past me. The only thing I can compare it to is stale urine, combined with the smell of an old dog that had lived his entire life in his owner's backyard. Another noise to my right startled me so badly I nearly jumped from my skin. Having had enough of this, I grabbed my flashlight and aimed into the forest where I heard the second noise. What I saw still terrifies me to this day, 20 years later. No more than 50 feet from me did the beam of my flashlight land on the chest of a massive creature. I don't have words for it. And, to top it off, this thing was standing on 2 legs. Not 4, like a normal animal. 2, like a human. It was extremely muscular and extremely tall. I'm above average height for a woman at 6 foot tall, and this monster was towering over me. If I had to approximate its height, I would put it over 7 feet tall. It was jet black and had a canine-like head, which included a very large muzzle, and its eyes were a yellow amber color, which it used its hands to shield when my flashlight beam bounced off of its face. The hands, yes, hands, not paws, are the fuzziest in my memory, but if I recall correctly, they were almost a sickening combination of paw and hand. How I took in so much detail in the mere seconds I stared upon this creature is beyond me, but they're details that I will never, ever forget. Every muscle in my body was frozen, but every neuron in my brain was screaming to flee to my car. As I turned, I made another horrifying realization. This beast wasn't alone. Before me was yet another of these creatures, only this one was on all fours. It too had the yellow amber colored eyes and canine head. It too was jet black. It was stalking towards me as my back was turned, but froze when I cast my light onto it. Was this creature sneaking up on me while its partner was causing a fatal distraction? The creature that was on all fours stared up at me, its mouth open. Its mouth seemed to be full of huge, pointed teeth that could easily tear me to shreds. I was frozen in terror, my mind still trying to relate to me what I was even looking at. For all intents and purposes, I was standing in the middle of two huge werewolves. But surely these monsters can't exist, is what my brain was trying to tell me. However, there, right in front of me, were two allegedly fake movie monsters. I was sure I was going to be killed and eaten by this pair of monsters, my body never being found again, or my friend possibly following my ribbons into our campsite and finding the remnants of my carcass, maybe even suffering the same fate that I did. Remembering that you should never run away from a predator, I slowly began to back away from them. To my horror, the monster on all four legs took a step closer to me. I glanced over at his friend. It hadn't moved a muscle. I continued to back away, silently praying that there wasn't a third monster right behind me, waiting for the right moment to strike. The monster didn't move from where he was, so I backed away even more. Still, it stood motionless. At this point, I had succumbed to the most frightening amount of terror I have ever endured, and my flight instinct took over completely. I ran. However, I ran in the only direction I could, away from my car. The creature that was on all fours was blocking the path that I had used to get from my car to my site. I was cut off from the only means of escape that I had. For several moments, it sounded to me as if they were both chasing after me. I could hear heavy footfalls of the pair chasing after me. I could hear breathing and grunting and growling coming from behind me. The footfalls themselves made these things sound incredibly heavy. Still, having no idea what I was facing, I had no way of knowing how well these things could see in the dark. Were they nocturnal? How much of a disadvantage was I at? Was it going to be a quick death, or was I going to be eaten alive? The terror was overwhelming. As I ran, I sobbed, hoping that I wouldn't run out of breath from crying and sobbing and running for my life. I haven't the slightest idea how far or how long I ran, but at that point, my lungs were on fire, and the only thing I was managing to do was isolate myself even further into the woods. But still, I continued to run through the forest, tripping over miscellaneous forest obstacles as I tore through the woods in terror. I was trying my best to stifle my screams of fear, but I could not seem to get a grip on the tears that were flowing freely down my face. And then, I made a decision. I stopped running. And then, as if I were the central victim of a bad horror movie, I aimed a flashlight in the direction that I had just come from. I can remember the beam bouncing around as I shook uncontrollably. I held my breath and listened. All I could hear were the peaceful sounds of nature again, and this gave me some measure of calm. For the quietness that I experienced before was a sure sign, in my opinion, that the giant predators were present. Hopefully, because nature was talking into the night again, that was an indication that they had stopped giving chase. I remained still for the longest time and continued to listen, holding my hand over the light of my flashlight. I could feel the sting on my face and bare arms where the brush had scratched my skin. Now worried that the blood from my wounds would attract these things, I started to gasp for breath. It was one of those moments where terror had still taken over you, and even trying to breathe was difficult. I decided to myself that I was at a crossroads, and a decision had to be made. Should I keep running further into the woods and wait it out until morning? Or should I risk doubling back towards my car and possibly running right into these creatures again? I took a deep breath, prayed to God it wouldn't be my last, and gathered my courage for the run back towards my car. I silently patted myself on the back for always wearing my car key on a chain around my neck. I took one more moment to listen for anything heading my way, and then I sprinted back the way that I had just come. As I ran through the forest, I was suddenly very aware of the damage to my face and arms. They were taking a serious beating from the trees and bushes, but I pushed it out of my mind and continued to run. After what seemed like an eternity, I saw the light of my campfire and blew through my sight. I didn't take the opportunity to look around, but for the few brief seconds I was at my sight, no monsters were visible. The rest of my run was uneventful, yet still terrifying. As I ran, I couldn't help but think back to the previous day, where the hike into this once wonderful area was so peaceful. That calm had been shattered forever. I finally, and thankfully, made it to my car and wasted no time securing myself inside. I turned on the ignition and turned on the lights, half expecting to see one or both of the monsters standing in front of me. Thankfully, nothing was there, and I drove as fast as I could in the dark. Again, half expecting to see one of them standing in the middle of the road in front of me, or running out across the road to scare me into crashing. I drove straight home. By the time I arrived, it was nearly 4:30 in the morning. Even at this early hour, I called my friend and told her I'd returned home, and the camping trip was no longer happening. When she asked why, all I could say was I would fill her in on the details at another time. For 3 years, she was the only person I shared my story with. I still don't understand what I witnessed that ill-fated night. Like I mentioned previously, I still have not been back in the woods since then. I never returned to collect my belongings. I never finished City of Bones, because anytime I tried, all I could think about was that night. Until that night, I was firm in my opinion that Sasquatch and others like him were make-believe. What I saw, though, changed the way that I look at the world. These creatures are definitely out there. The fact that the first creature that I encountered seemed to be causing a distraction for the other to sneak up on me gives whatever they are a measure of intelligence I wouldn't expect to find in a mere animal. Not to mention how terrified I am when I think about how if I hadn't turned around, that creature could have pounced on me, and I wouldn't be here to tell you this story. What exactly were these creatures I encountered? With the possibility of being laughed at, I still believe it had to have been a pair of werewolves, or this dogman creature that everybody talks about. Whether these are monsters that are men in the daylight, or if they simply have these things somewhere, someplace, and they find campsites and attack people, doesn't affect my opinion. I do know one thing. The moon was not full that night. The other moment of my encounter that still gives me chills was the fact that this creature had the intelligence to put its claw up to its eyes to shield the flashlight beam. This reaction just gave him an almost human quality, or at least a human intelligence. And the way that that paw or claw or hand looked signifies to me that this was not just an animal. This is something that science hasn't discovered yet, or something that science is keeping hidden from us. Moreover, why did they cease their chase? I doubt I outran them. Why did they decide I wouldn't make a satisfying dinner? Did they ever intend to harm me at all? Were they simply chasing me off of their territory? Did they decide that I wasn't worth the chase because I wouldn't give them the energy that they required? These questions I will have for the rest of my life. Thank you for relaying my encounter to those that have a true interest in hearing what people like myself have to say. I'm positive you will do this story justice. In closing, I do know that there are people out there that are desperate to have encounters of their own with these creatures. I beg you, stay out of the woods at night. Don't go looking for these monsters. For all you know, they could kill you. Sincerely, Anonymous. My name doesn't matter. I'm good with you just referring to me and the other people in this story by whatever name you make up. What does matter is what we saw that day, because it was like nothing I've ever seen before, and luckily since then either. I like to flip houses. It's a good way to get a lot of money on the side, and until that day, I've never had any issues with it. I was 47 at the time. That was 5 years ago. And my son Max, who was with me that day, was 16. I had passed by this house off the road numerous times, driving up and down the 141 for business, and it always intrigued me. It was very much vacant, but it was huge. I'm not gonna lie, I saw dollar signs every time I drove by it. Then one day, while coming back from Florence with my son, I got a wild hair up my ass and decided to drive down the road to the house to take a look. I just wanted to see what condition it was in, and if there were any indications that I could flip it and make a profit off of it. We shouldn't have gone down that road. We parked the car and got out. It was obvious that no one had been there for a while. The paint was peeling, the porch looked terrible, some windows were broken, but I didn't think it was a waste of time by any means. The property looked huge. Big fields behind it and off to the side. Lots of trees after that. We decided to take a look around. Walked up the porch and looked inside. No furniture, no blinds or anything like that. It was clear to me that nobody lived there and hadn't for a long time, so I felt okay just walking around and taking a look. The porch made some pretty dicey noises though. It would have to be completely ripped out and replaced for sure. I was starting to get excited about the prospects, and I wanted to look around back. The two of us walked down the steps and made our way around the back, but as we talked, Max stopped me and asked if I had heard the noise that he did. I didn't, and asked what he was talking about, and he said it sounded like something big had taken off at a run. I shrugged it off, thinking it was some kind of animal. Trust me, what we ended up seeing, or even another person being out there, were the furthest things from my mind. I continued around the back, and Max followed. When we got there, we witnessed two things. The first was the smell. It was disgusting, awful, horrible, putrid. It smelled like rotten meat, dirty animal, shit, urine, all of that all at once. I actually gagged at the smell as Max laughed at me. The second thing we found were the remnants of some kind of hooved animal. I say some kind because what was left of it was beyond identification. There was no head. Most of it was all chewed up. There were claw marks and huge bite wounds where meat was ripped off. I could see bone and tendons. The abdomen was ripped open, and everything was gone, except for some intestines. We were spooked by that. I thought it might be the reason for the smell, but this poor creature didn't look decayed. Hell, It looked fresh. I was just about to tell Max we should go when I saw something large and out of this world fast dart through the long grass in the fields, causing this flock of some kind of bird to explode from the grass too. I damn near shit myself right there. When I say fast, I don't mean like a cougar or a bear or something like that. I mean it shouldn't be able to move like that. It was a blur of black fur at first. Just a big, black, shaggy mass crashing through the weeds and grass towards the trees on the other side, towards the left hand of the back side of the house. It looked like it had a big hump or something on its back too. It was definitely time to leave. I told Max to run, to get the hell to the car, because we needed to leave. After hearing the commotion in the field, he was more than willing to move. He was asking me what it was, but I didn't know. I just wanted to get my son to safety. We got in the car, and I started to calm down. The safety of being inside the car was actually comforting, until the next thing that happened. You see, until I saw that creature, I thought it was just some large kind of predator or something out there. And then I actually heard Max gasp and grab my arm. I looked at him. He was staring out of the windshield, absolutely terrified. I looked in the direction that he was looking, and I gasped next. Standing at the corner of the house was the absolute biggest wolf creature I've ever seen. I knew instantly what it was. I've heard those rumors all my life, but I couldn't believe it was real. Was I really looking at the Michigan Dogman, or the Beast of Bray Road? Whatever the hell it was standing there in broad daylight, staring at us. My description of it is as follows. But mind you, it never stood up on two legs, so I don't know how tall it would have actually been. At the shoulder, though, I'd say 3.5 to 4 feet tall, based off of the relative height of the porch. It was shaggy and dark brown, canine-like. Completely canine-like. Its back was sloped, like a person walking on all fours, and the hump I saw earlier turned out to be these massive shoulder muscles. In fact, it was very muscular, everywhere. It had a long snout, a long tongue that held out of its mouth, short ears. I couldn't see a tail, but that doesn't rule out that it didn't have one. And it was just staring at us, looking pissed and evil all at once. I could see it blink, slowly. It was the real deal. Then, it reached its front arm up and back behind its head. There were distinct fingers, like a raccoon. It started scratching at the back of its head. Not like a dog with its back foot, but like a human does. It scratched methodically. Not like how a dog just goes to town. This was slow and deliberate. Very human-like qualities. I could barely breathe. I slowly felt for the ignition, not taking my eyes off of that thing. I turned the car on, and it just continued to stare. When I put it in reverse, I slammed on the gas. It was time to make our move and get the hell out of there. I sped backwards as fast as I could without running into anything. When the car started moving, it darted forward, towards us, but only 10 feet or so. Max cried out when it moved. It was impossibly fast, and all I could think was, not today. It turned back around and darted towards the back of the house again, faster than any living thing I have ever seen move. I spun the car around and floored it out of there, back on the 141, and sped all the way back home. I told Max to look up the Beast of Bray Road as we drove home. We were about 50 minutes from our house, so we had time for him to read through dozens of encounters. And believe me, there's more encounters with that thing than I want to read. I'm sure some of them are bullshit, but others like mine, I guarantee you are true. Max posted our story on some Facebook group, and the responses just started lighting up his phone. Lots of people asking lots of questions. They wanted a description. They wanted to know where it was at. We gave them a rough location, but I refused to tell them exactly where it was because most of the people asking questions were a bunch of dumb kids wanting to get social media famous by going out there. I wasn't about to give them the location and have them get hurt or eaten like that poor creature that we stumbled upon. When we got home, we told my wife about it, and after a short but frustrating argument, she came around to believing what we said we saw. We got into contact with a few other people on that Facebook group that had encounters around the same area, but we've lost contact with them in the 5 years it's been since we saw that creature. You know how it is meeting people on Facebook. I still drive past there for work, and we have some friends up in Wisconsin, so I'm kind of forced to go that way. But let's just say when I do, I drive a hell of a lot faster than I should, just to get away from there. It still looks vacant. I mean, I'm not going in there and investigating because I don't want to run into that thing again. But driving by, it looks derelict. And after seeing that thing and doing some thinking about that house, I'm not surprised at all why nobody lives there. I mean, I sure as hell wouldn't want to live in a house where Dogman frequents the area. Thank you for posting this. Thank you for keeping my name and actual location anonymous. I hope I don't have to contact you again, but if I do have another encounter, you'll be the first one to hear it.